In this podcast episode, Raymond Ibrahim discusses the complex history and enduring theological doctrines of Islam that have shaped its interactions with the West. He explores the historical conquests by Muslim forces, the ideological foundations driving Islamic expansion, and the challenges posed by contemporary Muslim immigration to Western countries. Ibrahim also reflects on his own background as a Coptic Christian of Egyptian descent and the broader cultural and religious dynamics underlying Muslim-Christian relations. Throughout, he contrasts Islamic teachings with Christian doctrines, assesses misconceptions about Islam in the West, and considers the possibilities and limitations of Islamic reform or enlightenment. Ibrahim opens by detailing the rapid historical expansion of Islam from the 7th century, emphasizing that within a century after Muhammad's death in 632 AD, Muslim armies had conquered 3/4 of the Christian world, including regions like Egypt, Syria, Turkey, and North Africa. These territories were predominantly Christian before the advent of Islam, with prominent centers such as Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Constantinople falling under Muslim control. He points out that this era involved continuous warfare known as Jihad, which shaped a millennia-long pattern of conquest driven by religious and ideological motives rather than mere tribal conflicts. He highlights common misunderstandings in the West, where many assume countries like Egypt or Turkey were always Muslim or intrinsically Eastern, neglecting their rich Christian histories. Ibrahim references how historic warfare, enslavement, and religious subjugation were systemic, reflecting Islamic doctrines that mandated war against non-Muslims, referred to as infidels or kafirs, requiring them to convert, pay tribute as second-class citizens, or face death. Central to Ibrahim's thesis are three intertwined Islamic doctrines that he argues uniquely contribute to Islam's incompatibility with Western values. The first is a theological concept he translates as loyalty and enmity, prescribing unwavering allegiance and loyalty to fellow Muslims, while demanding hostility and disavowal toward non-Muslims. This surpasses mere tribalism. It frames Muslims as a unified ummah, transnational community, opposed to all non-Muslims. The second doctrine is jihad. While often translated as holy war, Ibrahim notes jihad's broader meaning as struggle or striving in the way of Islam, which historically primarily manifested as violent warfare aimed at conquest. However, modern Islam recognizes multiple forms of jihad, including jihad of the tongue, propaganda, jihad of the pen, preaching, jihad of money, financial support for Islamic causes, and baby jihad, which encourages Muslims to have many children to demographically dominate non-Muslim societies. These multifaceted jihads, especially in Muslim migrant populations in the West, propagate Islamic advancement ideologically, culturally, and physically. A third critical doctrine involves the condition of conquered non-Muslims as dhimmis, second-class citizens who pay tribute and are subjected to systemic humiliation and social restrictions, codified in Islamic jurisprudence and exampled historically by humiliating treatment such as forced crawling and slapping. Ibrahim stresses that this deep-rooted practice continues culturally in many Muslim-majority countries. Ibrahim critiques Western nations, particularly the UK, Germany, France, and Sweden, for a lack of understanding of Islam's historical and doctrinal nature when accepting large Muslim migrations. He warns of the demographic and ideological consequences, citing high Muslim birth rates and the encouragement of Islamist activism within these communities. He explains that many Muslims view migration to non-Muslim lands as problematic or forbidden, except as a tactical move related to jihad. This results in a dual attitude among Muslim migrants, ranging from nominal, secularized Muslims who coexist peacefully to Orthodox or devout Muslims committed to Islamic law and conquest, who may engage in covert or overt hostility while living in the West. The episode also addresses growing tensions in Europe, such as rising crime rates disproportionately involving Muslim migrants, and political responses, including parties like the Restore Britain movement. Ibrahim stresses that Western societies invite these challenges due to permissive immigration policies and a decline of self-confidence and cultural pride, contrasting Western self-flagellation with Muslim cultural assertiveness and unity. Ibrahim shares his personal story as a Coptic Christian born in the United States to Egyptian immigrant parents. The The Copts, he explains, are the indigenous Christian minority in Egypt descended from pre-Islamic inhabitants, often facing systemic discrimination and violence under Muslim majority rule. However, he emphasizes that most Copts have lived alongside Muslims peacefully and do not harbor hatred, though persecution has increased in recent decades. He clarifies that his scholarly interest in Islamic history and doctrine stems not from bitterness, but from an academic and objective study of history and religious texts, including reading the Quran in its original Arabic. Ibrahim argues that his critical perspective arises from facts and historical realities rather than personal grievance. Ibrahim highlights the distortions and fake histories that, in his view, have clouded Western understanding of Islam. One pervasive myth is the notion of peaceful coexistence between Christians and Muslims for centuries until evil crusaders disrupted the harmony. Instead, he points out, Muslim conquests involved widespread destruction, atrocities, and subjugation long before the Crusades. He also challenges simplistic narratives that attribute historical slavery solely to European colonial powers, noting that Muslim societies enslaved many groups across centuries and that abolition often originated in the West. The episode further critiques modern Western guilt and self-flagellation around colonialism, contrasted with the current wave of Muslim migration, reflecting a disconnect between historical awareness and present policy. Ibrahim draws insightful comparisons between Christian and Islamic religious texts and their socio-political effects. While both religions contain violent imagery and prescriptions in their scriptures, he argues that the Bible's Old Testament is historically and linguistically specific, describing events targeting definite ancient peoples, whereas the Quran's language is generalized and prescriptive in the present tense, commanding Muslims to fight non-Muslims continually until subjugation. He points out that Islamic law codifies violence such as beheadings, crucifixions, stoning, and other punishments, which remain part of Sharia and can be actively invoked by Orthodox Muslims today. Conversely, Christian societies have largely abandoned literal enforcement of Old Testament laws and emphasize peaceful teachings from the New Testament. Ibrahim also engages with the idea of militant Christianity, referencing the historical muscular Christianity and the medieval crusaders who saw the use of the sword as a necessary defense and expression of faith. Contrasting this with modern Western secular diminishment of Christianity's cultural and social role. The episode explores whether Islam is capable of a genuine enlightenment or reform analogous to the Protestant Reformation in Christianity. Ibrahim is skeptical about the prospects because reform must come organically from within Muslim communities themselves, and he observes that many Muslims do not view external criticism positively. He explains that Islamic scholarship traditionally maintained clerical authority over Quranic interpretation and law, Sharia. But with modern literacy and access to sacred texts, a wave of radicalized Muslim Protestants emerge who eschew clerical moderation and instead read the texts literally, often becoming more extreme. Moreover, the legalistic nature of Islam, with its codified punishments and clear injunctions of enmity, makes reformation difficult compared to Christianity's more spiritualized interpretation. While reforms have been proposed, the current climate often leads to increased, not decreased, radicalization. Ibrahim laments Western society's loss of cultural confidence, traditional values, and faith in their own heritage, which creates a vacuum that Islam, with its clear identity and global solidarity, seeks to fill. He views the West's current leniency toward illiberal Muslim ideologies and mass immigration as self-destructive. He points to examples like Hungary and Poland, which have resisted mass Muslim immigration and maintained social cohesion, contrasting them with countries like the UK, France, and Spain. He criticizes Western permissiveness toward behaviors such as public displays of support for extremist groups and the suppression of patriotic symbols. Ibrahim believes that profound paradigm shifts, beyond mere political policy changes, are necessary for the West to preserve itself and resolve the tensions posed by Islamization. Toward the podcast's conclusion, Ibrahim reflects on his personal religious stance. He identifies more as a civilizational Christian rather than a devout spiritual believer, emphasizing Christianity's foundational role in shaping Western civilization's values, legal systems, human rights, freedoms, and cultural achievements. He argues that the West's secular society continues to operate on Christian principles, whether believers acknowledge it or not. The erosion of this civilizational framework contributes to vulnerability in the face of ideological competitors like Islam. Ibrahim also discusses how historic Christian attitudes toward violence and defense, such as chivalry and two swords doctrine, encompass a tradition of justified defense and martial readiness that modern Western interpretations have often lost. The guest cites important episodes such as the Reconquista in Spain, the expulsion and forced conversions of Muslims, and the centuries-long conflicts between Islamic and Christian powers as repeating patterns of confrontation and ideological clash. He draws parallels between historical Muslim efforts to subvert Christian-majority societies covertly through taqiyya, dissimulation, and their contemporary presence in Western countries, warning of similarly insidious dynamics. Ibrahim discusses warnings from figures such as Thomas Jefferson, who encountered Muslim diplomats with explicit statements about Islamic hostility toward non-Muslims, underscoring that Western societies have forgotten or ignored historical Islamic attitudes and warnings when engaging with Muslim populations. The episode concludes with reflections on the cyclical nature of societies rising and falling based on cultural strength, discipline, and belief, suggesting that Western weakness invites challenges from uncompromising ideologies like Islam.